There were some fascinating games in round 3 of the Candidates Tournament in Moscow today. I've gone with a game between Anish Giri and Sergei Karjakin. Now, this is a Queen's Indian, a standard position. And there's something quite curious. Yesterday, Karjakin played the white side of this opening against Nakamura. Today, Karjakin is playing the black side of it. He's a real expert. And yesterday, Karjakin played Queen c2 and then brought the rook to d1. Later on, this bishop was manoeuvred round to b2. But today, Giri decided to manoeuvre the bishop to b2 straight away, and this bishop certainly can play a very important role on the long diagonal sometimes, as we'll see. So, knight d7. Of course, you need to bring out the knight. Bishop b2, everything very normal. Bishop d6. Okay, so black has managed to straighten out his pieces in a very nice way. Already threat to the knight on e5, which drops back to d3. But in a sense, Giri is playing very much in using Karjakin's strategy from yesterday. He's basically waiting to see whether black is going to play c5, and then he'll be able to put pressure on the d5 pawn. a5 from Karjakin. Well, okay, what's the point of this? Well, of course, black is trying to prevent this sort of standard minority attack with b5. But Giri, after the game, said he somehow wasn't too impressed with this move. He felt that sometimes it can leave black's queenside a little bit weakened. We'll see how and why a little bit later. Sometimes the pawn may be able to advance, of course not at the moment. Rook c1. This game is very, very subtle with these different pawn moves, and it's very hard to know whether they're strong or weak. Anyway, rook c1, normal move, of course, on the semi-open c file. And now black has that dilemma, as is so often the case with this kind of pawn structure. You have to decide what to do with the c-pawn. Do you leave it on c7? Do you play the pawn to c6? Or do you play the pawn all the way to c5? Now, playing c5, I think we'll just leave the pawns too weak. But there is now a threat to play knight b5. So Karjakin prevents that with c6. Of course, it does lock in the bishop, but the bishop can come to a6. But the problem when you play c6 is that it leaves that b6 pawn slightly weakened, and this was what Giri was alluding to when he said he found the pawn move a5 a little bit strange, because it means that pawn on b6 needs a little bit of attention. At the moment it's defended by the queen and knight, but in the long term could be a problem. And of course, if the pawn advances, then the knight can hop in c5. Rook comes to c8, protecting c6, and that's going to allow the bishop to come to this splendid diagonal. So although you could say those pawns are a little bit sensitive, well, they're certainly not, I wouldn't call them weak in any way. Sensitive, yes, but not really weak, because white can't put any more pressure on them. e3, so super solid from Giri. He's just making sure there's going to be no pressure on e2 when the bishop comes to a6. A very nice diagonal. And then rook e1, just stepping out of this pin. And now Karjakin played h5. And Giri said after the game, h5 confused me tremendously. Well, h5 is a pretty standard move in this kind of position. Of course, black would like to play, if possible, sometimes play h4 to weaken the g3 pawn. And also, well, as we'll see, it takes g4 under control as well. There was a decent alternative. Knight e4 is very, very interesting. And Giri said after the game that he was expecting this move and thought that black should be okay here. The point is, white would very much like to push away the knight, but actually this sacrifice really gives black quite a persistent initiative. It's certainly not a winning attack, but this is extremely dangerous. You know, with bishop's nice squares, maybe the rook can come up as well. Giri said afterwards that he was probably going to play bishop at h3 and actually probably just allow a draw after this. Interesting. But h5, standard kind of move. After bishop h3, here's an interesting moment. Of course, there's pressure on this diagonal and on the knight, and therefore also on b6. So actually, Karjakin had prepared this move, knight g4, blocking out the bishop. But of course, you know, this is a pawn sacrifice. After the game, Giri said that, I mean, this is a critical moment in the game, that somehow he convinced himself that f3 wasn't a good move. But this is a critical moment in the game. It's so complicated. Giri's judgment was probably correct. In fact, after rook takes e3, I mean, this gets very wild. Of course, this is a computer variation. Black takes here. So black has won a pawn, but that knight on e3 is slightly, well, very trapped, really. However, black actually seems to get enough play after queen g5 and after bishop d7. Apparently, this is enough to make a draw. It's extremely complicated, but anyway, I just thought it was interesting that Giri's judgment here was probably correct. f3 certainly doesn't give white the advantage. But it's also not in his style to go in for those kind of complications if he can't quite see the way ahead, and there he didn't, and so preferred to play something a lot safer. He played knight f4, which is probably a good move. He was hoping that Karjakin would exchange off this knight, and then he thought that white would have a very pleasant position, and that seems to be so. Basically, once that bishop goes, then, well, I think it's quite clear that with these 4 pawns in front of the king, white's king side is very solid. And now the pressure will start to intensify on the queen side. Now there's a real threat to take on g4, and of course if that knight goes back, well, that bishop looks really nice here. So instead Karjakin played g6, so he's still offering a pawn sacrifice. And this time Giri took it, and then knight f6. So very interesting, very creative from Karjakin, giving up a pawn, but without that light square bishop, these squares look quite sensitive. So, for example, after queen f3, knight e4, both players thought that here black had pretty decent compensation. In this case, the bishop doesn't look very special on b2. Knight's wonderful on e4, and you never know, later on there could be the chance to play king g7 and switch a rook to the h file. It's decent compensation. So, instead of that, Giri played his queen forward to g5, and then bishop e7. Well, careful, there's going to be some kind of discovered attack. But of course, at this moment, this is what Giri had prepared. He plunged in on g6. So we've got one of these typical positions. White has 3 pawns for the piece, and the queen is right through onto the king. Now here, you might imagine that king f8, bringing the king closer to the rest of his pieces, is the correct move. But actually, after this, it rather sort of blocks in the rook and the queen, and it's not easy to sort of neutralize white's attack. So, for example, white has time to play f3 and e4, and this is dangerous. Instead, Karjakin played king h8, which at first glance looks rather odd, particularly when you put the king on the same diagonal as the bishop. But black has enough here. In fact, Giri forced a draw very quickly. There are some interesting possibilities. e4 I rather like, with the idea that if d takes e4, you play rook e3 with the idea g4 and rook h3 and mate here, and sometimes d5 of course could be very useful indeed. But after e4 it seems that bishop b4 is a good move, with the idea that if rook e3 you can play rook e4 and that neutralizes the attack. Again, Giri's judgment proved correct. Feeding this position into a computer doesn't see any win for white. So Giri basically decided to force a draw with knight c5. Well, it's an attractive move. You'd feel it like it should be forcing a win. Clearly, this is attacked. The knight might well switch in here. So this knight has to be taken, and then it opens up the diagonal of the bishop. But it's still not enough for white to win. Karjakin played well, played rook f8. And here Giri forced a draw with the queen h6 and queen g6. If he tries for more, let's say e4, then d4 cuts out the bishop, and after rook d1, queen e8. White doesn't have time to get this over, and suddenly, well, black is going to be winning this position. So queen h6 happened. The knight can't block. That's against the rules of chess. King came across, and then queen g6, and it's just a draw by perpetual check. Well, draw in 30 moves, but I think there was so much going on in that game. I found it fascinating struggle, full of very nuanced play actually, and the players were very well matched. Let me just very quickly show you what happened in the game between Topalov and Aronian. Let's find the game. Well, Aronian won, but this is how he won. This was right at the start of the game, and this shows that Topalov is really not in great form. Topalov has already given up a pawn, but he has some compensation. If he now, for example, exchanges on d5 and plays bishop b2, well, those bishops, I think, certainly give white enough compensation for a pawn. But instead, Topalov played rook d1, which looks like a very normal move, pinning. But Aronian took on e4, and the move that Topalov, of course, was relying on was bishop takes knight with the pin. But here, black has queen f6, unpinning, hitting the rook and hitting the bishop. And if, for example, rook b1, you take, and, well, black is still a pawn up, but having lost this light square bishop, white's position is dreadful. Winning position for black. So in the game, Topalov didn't even bother taking. He played bishop b2, but now he's 2 pawns down, and objectively this position was already winning for black, and Aronian really didn't have any trouble in finishing the game off. So after 3 rounds, 3 players share the lead with 2 out of 3. Levon Aronian, Vishwanathan Anand, and Sergei Karjakin. It's already very, very tense, very close indeed.